Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 37th webinar in the Offshore Wind Series, Learning from the Experts. I'm Peter Lyons, Senior Advisor on NYSERDA's Offshore Wind team focused on economic development and supply chain development. And it's my pleasure to be joined by today's experts, Kristian Ravn and Andreas Schønbeck. Kristian is with the firm Green Ducklings, and Andreas is with the Danish law firm Horten. Before I introduce Kristian and Andreas, a few reminders for the participants and some background on this webinar series. Next slide. Firstly, if you're experiencing any technical issues, please contact Sal Graven at the email address at the bottom of this slide. This webinar is being recorded, and the recordings and presentation slides for all webinars in the Learning from the Experts series are available on NYSERDA's website at the address on this slide. All participants have been muted. We will have time for Q&A following the presentation, so please use the Q&A function to submit your questions for the speaker. Next slide, please. New York State is working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of at least 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's goals of 70% renewable sources of electricity by 2030 and 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. While offshore wind has been providing clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is brand new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with accessible, impartial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting this educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts in key topics in offshore wind. We endeavor to select learning from the expert speakers based on their expertise, not necessarily for an alignment of opinions with NYSERDA or the state of New York. If you'd like to suggest a topic or speaker for a future webinar, you can email us at offshore-wind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out a survey also available on our website, nyserda.ny.gov/osw-webinar-series. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenters. Next slide. It's now with my pleasure to introduce you to Kristian and Andreas. Kristian holds a Master's of Science in Engineering and is a co-founder and executive advisor at the strategic consulting firm Green Ducklings. With a background of 20+ years of experience in working with offshore wind projects, of which 15+ years are in top management positions at technical companies working with offshore wind projects, Kristian has a unique understanding of the strategic value to offshore wind and related decision-making processes. Kristian has worked with most offshore wind sectors in Europe, the US, and Asia. Andreas is a partner at the Danish law firm Horten and specializes within complex contracts, both in relation to drafting, negotiating, interpreting, and other contractual matters. Andreas has more than 10 years of experience as in-house counsel at some of the world's leading onshore and offshore wind turbine manufacturers. Through the years, he has worked internationally and negotiated contracts globally. Thank you, and I'll now hand things over to our speakers.
So, testing, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Kristian.
Great. Well, thanks for the introduction, Peter, and setting a backdrop for this presentation. So I hope that I can live up to the nice words that you just told about me. My name is Kristian Ravn. I'm a co-founder of Green Ducklings, a strategic advisory, as Peter named, and we are supporting supply chain companies worldwide and also developers with certain processes like bid management, etc. So what I want to touch upon is trends and tendencies that affects the US supply chain at the moment. It's a bit of a different topic than we usually do. And normally we have a sole topic of how to improve your odds for success in offshore wind, but I thought I'd like to use the opportunity to also touch upon what we're seeing at the moment, which probably since you're joining this webinar, it hasn't passed you by that there's been some turbulence recently, especially for some of the US offshore wind projects. And I wanted to reflect a bit on that, including which opportunities it provides for US suppliers. So next slide, please. This one is just on Green Ducklings. We are working always in the gray zone between technical expertise, commercial considerations, market insights, and stakeholder management. So it's, I usually say we're not the best in anything, but we know how things link together across these different areas of expertise. Next, Peter. Let it be stated that the political ambitions for building offshore wind are sky high, both in Europe, which is the home market for offshore wind, where I come from, but also in North America, namely the US. And the targets that you see on the screen here remains unchanged. It's still a fast-growing market, and it's only just beginning. And this is why it's a pleasure to be able to share some of the knowledge that we gained through decades in Europe to support you guys in the supply chain in the US to tap into this. We really need good local suppliers to manage these targets and make it a national success story to the US and also from a state perspective. I think New York is one of the front runners with 9 gigawatts ambitions for 2035 and some other very ambitious targets that kind of sets the scene for a new US green transition. So the market is there, political ambitions are there, and we usually say it's not so much whether it's 35 gigawatts by 2030, whether it's 35, 30 or 40, doesn't really matter. It's a huge market, and I'll come back to that. Next slide, please. Right now, the turbulence that I touched upon before was referring to some of the recent announcements of delays and renegotiation of tariffs in the US projects, but also in some European projects in a bad combination of some different factors, which I'll get back to. This is obviously something that can cause some delays to the build out. On the other hand, it's also good news for local supply chain companies, and because we believe the pain points for the developers are clear, and already the developers put big investments into to the US offshore wind projects. So we believe that there can be a space of opportunity in these delays as well. But I'll get back to what that means specifically. Next slide, please. Speaking of investments, this was the result of the last seabed lease round in New York Bight, and the total number of payments for these 6 seabed leases was more than $4 billion, and those are money that are paid up front in the project. So it's a commitment from these developers, just underlining the fact that they have a lot on stake. It's not only about tariffs, this one, and whether they want to retract or not. They already invested a lot, and now we need to make these projects happen by getting the cost and income to match each other so that they can be really built. So the seabed lease rights, they have been secured by developers. There are also more than these ones. This was just the last round. And it's quite easy because it's just paying a premium. So you push the button and you do a bidding contest, and the ones who bids the most gets the seabed lease rights. That's an easy one. So let's consider that a tick off, and then go to the next slide. The really interesting thing for suppliers is the qualification for the power purchase agreements. So when New York, for instance, like this spring, we're bidding out PPAs in a solicitation round, then this is where the local suppliers should really be aware of opportunities. So it's a lot about promises, because the sector building an offshore wind industry in a new country like the US, our new market for offshore wind, that requires subsidies, and when it requires subsidies, it's normally baked into the PPAs. And the return favor for those subsidies would be local job creation. It would be something that is also further enhanced by the national tax credits or the federal tax credits. It's something about investment plans and supply chain facilities, etc. And it's something that underlines that the bidders for the power purchase agreements will have the ability to execute the project. So the ones that awards the PPAs want to see a lot of beauty elements, as I usually call it. And this is where promises are given. Underneath the yellow part, you see some NREL figures about what it takes to build 30 gigawatts of offshore wind. It takes a lot of turbines, a lot of foundations, a lot of vessels, a lot of everything, and the investment amounts and the number of jobs created are huge. And the reason that I put it in here is that it's really when the PPAs are being bid for by the developers, this is where the developers will need local supply chain companies to support their storylines on how they can create the local jobs, how they will do investments into big capex expenditures, and how they want to execute this by also utilizing some local companies. And so this is where promises are defined, and this is where the risk appetite from the developers are defined. And as you have noted, probably then a lot of developers already qualified for power purchase agreements. That's why I put a green plus to the right of the slide. And then if you hit the button, all this then fills into what we call a list of conditions precedent that needs to be ticked off before the project can be investment decided. So all of the promises that have been given to supply chain, whether if you are a supplier and you were part of the setup that was proposed for the PPA, then you have a pretty good position. Then a contract obviously needs to be done after securing the PPA for the developer, and some further practical details need to be agreed between the developer and you as a supply chain company. Then this is also where the developer will be working with tax credits and making the investments happen, and how to execute, and timelines and vessel reservations and all this stuff. And once they have all this in place, they're ready to push the button and qualify for the financing that is required for the offshore wind project. This is the ideal world, and if you hit the button, then something turns red. And this is it's just to make you understand what is going on at the moment. Everything was lined up, all the conditions precedent were defined, but all of a sudden, because of some cost increases, that's also called inflation, some risks in terms of delays, for instance, delayed vessels or delayed other strategic supply chain elements, and because of the interest rates increases or hikes that have been done recently, then all of a sudden the business case doesn't make up. So in other words, this is what is the problem at the moment. This is the red sign that I put to the right here. So the business case doesn't add up, and there are a number of elements that the developers then will start focusing on. And I'm not saying this because I want to say that it's a big problem. I think it's also part of the opportunity, but it's important for supply chain companies to understand what it means to developers. So if we take the next slide. These are some of the impacts that we have identified at Green Ducklings to projects, and you can see there are quite a few US projects affected by these delays or this game of hardball, as we call it, but also one of the biggest UK projects have been delayed due to heavy cost increases and financing costs. I don't want to go into the details. It was just to show you when you get the presentation, then you can look into this further if you didn't notice it already. But it affects a lot of developers that are active in the US. Next slide, please. This means that the developers are lining up for a game of hardball, and these are some of the recent news after the Ørsted write-downs of their projects and the Avangrid's negotiation to get new tariffs in the state of Massachusetts, and also basically all developers trying to get the tariffs up and trying to run from the promises they gave when they secured the power purchase agreements. And that's the game of hardball that is going on at the moment. No more negative news. Now to the next slide, because the painkillers for the developers at the moment, we try to outline in this slide. So there are a number of elements that can help release the pain for the developers at the moment, the ones that were on the list on the previous slide. The obvious one is if we can just get the revenues up, and that means the tariffs, then and we can get it up to a certain level, then the business case is rebalanced and we can make the projects happen. That's the first go-to strategy for the developers at the moment. There's also another one. You can try to squeeze the costs. That's no good for suppliers. It's no good for developing a healthy industry, but nevertheless, they will be working on reducing costs as well, or risk in that regard. One answer could be to secure more tax credit than they originally calculated into their business case when securing the PPA. And there are a number of IRA elements that can help improve the. This was basically the whole intention of the Inflation Reduction Act when introducing it, that it should release some of the pain at least. Or you can take a wait and see strategy and wait for interest rates to come down, or the inflation, or let's say supply chain pressure that has been quite predominant recently is relieving again. So those are the four painkillers that could resolve the equation for the developers. If you push the button again. This also means that there are opportunities for suppliers on this. The awareness point, these four elements will take immediate attention for all of the developers. I'm pretty confident on that. When there is a delay, you also have time to reconsider your setup. So let's take it one by one. The renegotiation of tariffs, if political entities like the states that awarded the PPAs should in any case consider to increase the tariffs compared to what was originally agreed in the PPAs, it will almost as a certain cause additional requirements for local wealth creation. So it could be social benefits, environmental benefits, etc. So it's a political trade-off. In that equation, if you as a supplier would have any elements that could kick into this equation and help relieve the pain and give some return favors for better tariffs, then I think there's a window of opportunity to present that at the moment. The squeeze on suppliers to reduce costs, that will probably now a lot of the European projects, the US projects that are being delayed right now are to a large extent relying on a European supply chain. I think now there is a timeline that with the delays will allow reconsidering the setup, whether you could get lower cost or lower risk by thinking differently. That could be innovations, it could be good ideas for reducing costs or risks, and it basically links to the first point that I touched upon, that the developers will probably need to do more US in order to qualify for better tariffs. Then securing more tax credits, all the tax credit regimes are basically based on creating local value or job in the US. That links to the other 2 points. And then, as I stated, the last bullet, the delays are not necessarily bad because a lot of the supply chain, or the strategic supply chain, at least for the delayed projects, are coming out of the European supply chain. So now there might be time to better position for a real US supply chain, which I think is very much needed for reaching the ambitious targets for the industry. Yeah, next slide, please. This slide is a usually go-to slide. It's 5 clear advices to suppliers in new markets for offshore wind. And now I outlined the immediate attention points for the developers. These rules are more universal, and they still count. The developers they need your support as suppliers to help quantify how many jobs you can do locally, how you can do things that are better for the environmental impact by choosing a local supply chain, or you can help reduce the risks of the developers. And the risks can link to the elements I pointed out before. So it can be the risk of losing tax credits, it can be the risk of delays from the European supply chain, which is also to some extent affecting the US market. Or it could be in terms of helping to create more local jobs as a return favor for increasing tariffs. So that would be good ammunition for the developers when they try to find solutions how to realize their projects. So a clear response, not only delivering products or services, but also thinking these elements into play when approaching the developers. It will be really helpful for them, believe me. Then strategic partnerships with some of the EU suppliers has proven to be a good recipe for building local competence, and that still counts. I think there are a number of really good examples in the market at the moment. I think especially Ørsted have been a pioneer in matching the local suppliers with some European suppliers in a setup that is both bankable and has an acceptable risk profile, and recognizing that it comes with a cost premium, but that's the cost of creating an industry in the local market. So I think still partnerships should be considered with experienced companies when defining your roadmap into the industry. It could be a shortcut. Then the developers are not looking for bits and pieces, unfortunately. They have a very complex supply chain. They have a limited organizational power to procure bits and pieces, and therefore the more solution provider mindset you can have when approaching the developers, either as a standalone supply chain company or in a constellation with a partner. I think it's really important that you look at your value proposition and see how you can help provide solutions to some of the pain points that the industry is facing. that has proven, at least I think Rick Stisler is a good example on that. Have really created a lot of local value for some of the transition piece outfitting for some of the projects. And it's not only due to Rick Stisler, it's because Rick Stisler made it easy to choose this solution in a local setup with an acceptable risk profile. And then this shell of transition piece outfitting is used to drag in a lot of more suppliers that are also needed to realize those solutions. So I think that shows it's a good example on what is required to have success for the big chunks of supply chain elements. Then obviously operational excellence, that counts in offshore wind, it counts in every other industry. I think the special flavor to offshore wind is that it is so many components that are needed to build a wind farm. So it's not only deploying instrumentation for one foundation, it may be 50 or 100 foundations. So operational excellence really comes into play when you have some kind of a serial production and you want to scale the setup. And this is important to have this mindset and when doing the approach to the developers to show how you can actually scale the solutions that you provide. And that Andreas will come back to that, but it is not only scaling it from a technical perspective or from an asset perspective, it's also scaling it in a financially sustainable way so that you can actually bear the contract risks that follow with the scaling of the industry. And then number 5, solution development. I already touched upon the solution provider mindset, but I think the success stories that have already happened for local suppliers when tapping into the supply chain in the US with international developers, those success stories were realized because the developers and the suppliers, they got into the same room and tried to seek solutions. So when they ticked all of the other 4 boxes and there was actually a value for the developer, then they were sitting together and trying to find out how to make it happen in the most efficient way. So it can be either technical solutions, it can be solutions in terms of fulfilling the taking a bigger scope on board that allows the developer to choose a local setup, or it could be solutions that would increase the local job creation. So I think you need to sit at the same table across supply chain and developers, but to get in that position, then you need to tick the uppermost 4 boxes on this slide. I think that was my 20 minutes. So I would like to hand over to Andreas. There will be questions afterwards and some discussion points. So I hope that works. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Kristian. And we can proceed to my slides. Hello, everyone. As Peter mentioned in the beginning, my name is Andreas Schønbeck, and I'm partner with the Danish law firm Horten. I have a long-term background in wind, where I've worked for more than almost 15 years by now. And I will talk a little bit about the contractual framework you can expect when you enter into the offshore wind industry. And I've decided to structure my presentation in 3 main parts. So next slide, please. So first of all, I will introduce the contractual landscape. What does it look like? What contracts do we see, and how are they related? This will give you a sort of overview of the contractual landscape. And on that basis, we will proceed with a presentation on the developments and tendencies we see in the area, what to expect when you dive into the contractual area, when you start negotiating, when you start to close the contracts, and consider what risks and opportunities you would like to undertake. And from that standpoint, we will finalize with some recommendations, some key points and key objectives I would recommend that you have in mind and that you focus on when you do your contracting. So let's start with the contractual characteristics and the overview. So next slide, please. So on this slide, I try to highlight or give an overview of the contractual chart within offshore wind. And I structure this in 3 tiers, tier 1, 2, and 3, to sort of simplify the overview. If we look at tier 1, we have what we would describe as the project contracts, which essentially are the contracts between the developer of the wind farm or the owner of the wind farm on one hand, and the suppliers for the projects on the other hand. That could be suppliers of the wind turbines, that's the OEM supplier. We could have the foundation supplier, cable supplier, substation supplier, but also the O&M contractor. And you would also have contractors like the transportation installation contractor potentially. So that's a project contract we have between those contractors and the employer on the other side. Of course, when we look at this from the employer's point of view, there is also another important contract, which is the contract with the off-taker, the PPA, as Kristian mentioned previously. I will not go into detail with the PPA, but I've highlighted it here just to mention that's also an important part of the contractual overview. Then, if we look towards the left, then we get into the so-called supply chain of the industry. Now we have the contractors who have the contracts, the project contracts with the developer and the owner, and they will also do the contracting themselves in the supply chain with various suppliers. And those are the suppliers 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. And in turn, those suppliers will have their own contracts with their sub-suppliers. So here we have created an overview of the supply chain as such, and it's easy to see that there is a flow down of contracts from the developer and the owner towards the project contractors and the supply chain contractors in tier 2 and tier 3. And it's important to keep this overview in mind because those contracts will be connected one way or the other, perhaps not legally as such, but keeping the interplay between the contracts in mind will be essential and quite important when you have to control your risks and when you have to pass on those risks down the supply chain when you do the contracting with your own suppliers. That was the overview. Let's go to the next slide, please. So then we have introduced the overview of the contracts, and then the question is, what characteristics do we see with respect to those contracts? What characterizes those contracts? And first of all, we need to introduce the FIDIC contract system. FIDIC is the International Federation for Consulting Engineers, and they have a suite of contracts mainly targeted at the construction industry. But those contracts have been applied for many decades even for the oil and gas industry, and that has subsequently led to those contracts being applied in the wind industry also, especially the offshore wind industry. And if we have to highlight one particular FIDIC contract, that is the Yellow Book contract, which is the most prevalent contract in the offshore wind industry, especially if we focus on the project contracts. See if the overview I made before. We have various versions of this FIDIC Yellow Book. We have the 99 version and the 2017 version. And funnily enough, it's the 99 version which is the most commonly used. I think it's a question of what habits do you have when you do contracting. So even though the 2017 version has been available for a few years by now, it's still mostly the 99 version that we see used. Not in its original version, but in a highly adjusted version that fits the offshore wind industry. Considering that this type of contract is a construction contract, a construction template, it will also have some features that we know from construction contracts. It means that it is project specific. It means that, and this is due to its adaptation, it means that it has a maritime aspect since the work will be carried out mostly offshore. And then the Yellow Book has this special feature of the engineer. And the engineer is like a third party to the contract. It's a party who has to act impartially. He or she will have to make certain determinations and make certain decisions that will have an impact on the contract and on the construction process. So familiarizing yourself with the FIDIC Yellow Book also means that you have to familiarize yourself with the importance and the role of the engineer. Another aspect that is inevitable when you deal with construction contracts, that is that time and milestones are quite important. So program the time schedule and the milestones for the project development are quite important in the FIDIC system as well. And those important elements also have an impact on what are the main legal topics in that contract. And that is, of course, delays. Since we're dealing with a program, you need to ensure that you comply with the timing requirements. And if you are in delay, there is a risk of having to pay penalties, and you will probably not get the payments you want at the desired time, because the payment rates, the installments are closely related to achieving those milestones. The offshore wind industry is also very much focused on quality, and the first way of, or perhaps the primary way of ensuring the right quality is that you do a very thorough testing regime of the deliveries under the contracts before the deliveries are taken over. So you will very often have quite elaborated testing regimes being part of those contracts. We also see the knock for knock regime being applied. The knock for knock regime is a special type of liability regime that is inherited from the oil and gas industry, where the liability as such is inverted, where each party will bear the risk itself in case of damage. The damaged party will bear the risk itself rather than having an opportunity to make a claim against the other party. So that's also a quite special characteristic of the FIDIC contracts when it's applied in the offshore wind industry. If we leave the project contract and then dive into the tier 2 and tier 3 contracts in the supply chain, then we leave the FIDIC system. We rarely see FIDIC contracts or FIDIC inspired contracts in that part of the supply chain. In that part of the supply chain, we most often see framework contracts for services or for delivery of components and tools. That could be components for the turbines, or it could be components for the manufacture of the turbines or for the installation of the turbines. But they will most likely be framework contracts as opposed to the project contracts which we see in the relation between the project suppliers and the developers. The main topics here will also be delays, quality, defects, product liability, IPR, indemnities, and so on and so forth. So as such, the typical themes and topics in those contracts will not differ that much from the FIDIC contracts, but of course the structure is different. The way the contracts are drafted will be different, and more importantly, the contracts will often be framework contracts rather than project-specific contracts. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Then the big question is, when you engage in contracting in offshore wind, what is it you can expect? What should you expect? And just to be clear, you really need to expect that there is an unbalanced risk allocation. As a supplier, you will most often deal with customers who have a quite strong position when it comes to contracting. They will have tremendous bargaining power, and they will be aware of this, and they will use it. Not because they will not consider you as a partner, not because they want to appear more harsh than they need to, but simply because the risk allocation or the bargaining power is often so unbalanced that it's obvious that this will be used for the benefit of the customer. Does this mean that there is nothing to do negotiation-wise? Does this mean that you just have to comply with whatever requirements you're being met by or met with? Does this mean that there is no room for negotiation? Certainly not. It just means that you cannot expect as a supplier that you can win all the battles, that you can have it your way on all in all areas of the contracts, and that even the smallest topics during negotiations that you will succeed in negotiating those topics. You should not expect that. Conversely, you should expect that if you want to succeed in the contract negotiations, you really need to be able to pick your fights. You need to have a contracting strategy and a negotiation strategy, and that means you need to be able to pinpoint what are the areas in this contract that you're negotiating which have the most importance to you, which are the areas you need to stand firm on, and where you need to limit and mitigate your risk the most. And for certain topics in those contracts, it's obvious that those will be a focal point in any case. For instance, limitation of liabilities, or in case you're delivering components, the definition of what constitutes a defect will be an obvious area for negotiation. But there are several other areas you should consider at least, and the way to consider this is not to draw lots, obviously. That is to being able to analyze those contracts properly and analyze your position properly to assess what risks can you absorb, what risks can you pass on down the supply chain, and what risks do you really need to mitigate. And that is an assessment that deals with the interplay between the size of the risk and the probability of the risk. And if you cannot determine the size of the risk, and if you cannot determine the probability of the risk, you have a huge problem in determining what areas you need to focus on during negotiations. So here is that is an area I recommend that you spend a lot of time on, and then you really consider and perhaps also get advisory on the probability and the size of the risk. Another focal point is the qualification documentation process. Being available as a supplier is not necessarily enough for being selected as a supplier. You also need to be able to document that you are on top of your game. You have the right qualifications, you have the right certifications, and that you can document those matters, as well as document your business. If the customer requests certain documentation, you need to be able to deliver that documentation swiftly. It looks wrong if you first have to develop that documentation and prepare it. If you're not ready, this will definitely not benefit you. dealing with suppliers also means that you have to consider what does the supplier need from you. You may offer a certain scope of supply, a certain scope of services, a certain scope of components, but if the supplier demands or requests or need a broader scope, you need to consider how to or whether you can deliver that instead. And considering that means that you also need to consider doing partnerships with other customers, with other suppliers, as Kristian also alluded to. Do you need to team up with other companies to be able to deliver a broader scope, i.e. creating a partnership? Or do you even have to go one step further and consider mergers and acquisitions to develop your company and develop your ability to supply what is needed? So that is also quite important and something you need to expect and consider when you deal with this area. Then we have the cost out and price reductions process, which is an ongoing process within offshore wind. It has been part and parcel of the industry for even decades by now, and we see no tendencies of this focus abating. You will be asked to deliver cheaper components, deliver cheaper services, and to reduce your costs and price, perhaps to a greater extent than you're prepared to. And then finally, you should expect that HSE and ESG are important elements for your customer. It is perhaps not so much a surprise when we mention HSE, considering that the offshore wind industry it has certain connections to the oil and gas industry. It is obvious that health and safety and the environment plays a vital role, and we see no new developments or changes in that area. On the other hand, when it comes to ESG, we see rapid developments, especially in Europe, and those developments will probably also find their way to the US. It has become a license to operate that you work thoroughly and seriously with the ESG area. That it's not something that you just tick off in a box that you are aware of this, but also that you can document and demonstrate that this is a vital part of you conducting your business, that this is important to you, and that you comply with the requirements that you're being met by. So HSE is still here to stay, whereas ESG is perhaps not emerging. It's not a new thing, but the importance of this area cannot be overestimated. Next slide, please. Then if we have to highlight a few tendencies and a few focal points when we deal with the contracting in the business, focusing on quality is essential. These structures are placed on the sea, and if you deliver poor quality, it has a tremendous negative impact. It will be very costly, and your customer will suffer a lot of damages and costs, and they expect that you will be liable for those damages and costs. So focusing on the right quality is very important. Then I would also recommend that you make yourself aware of the project contracts, those contracts that I mentioned in the beginning, the contracts between the developer and the suppliers for the developer, because the risks that we see in those contracts, those are the risks that will be passed on through the supply chain. So when you as a supplier, perhaps a tier 2 supplier, sometimes wonder why you're met by certain requirements and why you're expected to take certain risks, the immediate answer is, and that is because your customer has undertaken those risks, and that customer is now trying to pass on that risk through the supply chain. So being aware of those risks in the beginning will help you eventually when you do the contracting, and also help you when you have to do the contracting with your own suppliers. And then I can only emphasize the importance of ESG as mentioned before. this is a focal point not just for your customer, but also for the customer's customer and their investors. So again, you should not be oblivious to the importance of this area. I also mentioned risks as a focal point, and that's obvious. That's a no-brainer, and most of you will already be quite aware of trying to determine the risks you face in the contract, and then trying to mitigate those risks. And that is of course fine, and I can only support that as a focal point. You know, facing risks is inevitable when you do contracting. But the big question and the big task is to figure out how to handle those risks. Then we also need to consider variations, because variations is not a special or marginal element of contracting. We see that quite often, but as Kristian also mentioned, the developments we've seen in industry recently means that that the timing of the projects changes, and that means that your customers will most likely ask you to postpone your deliveries, postpone your services, and request variations to the contracts. And that is and based on that, you need to be aware of how to handle those variations. You need to secure that when you're faced with variation requests, that you also have a variation regime in the contract that allows you to be compensated, not just in terms of time, but also in terms of cost, if you incur costs due to the variation. And then finally, and this goes perhaps hand in hand with these developments that we see, but it's also a general thing, you need to be aware of what investments are you making when you enter into this business. Do you have to do or make certain investments like purchasing construction equipment, enhancing the capability of your workforce, perhaps even increasing your workforce, and other similar investments? If you're making those investments, it is natural that you would like those investments to be returned one way or the other through the contract, through the pricing, through the payments from your customer. And that means you need security for that investment. And that could be in terms of setting the right price, ensuring that the right indexation of the price is in place. It could also be to get commitments from your customer for certain volume of purchases, certain volume of services they purchase, certain volume of components that they purchase from you, so on and so forth. And it also plays a vital role when it comes to termination of the contract, because even though you enter into a contract without focusing on the end of the contract and without perhaps taking the risk of the contract being terminated too seriously, it is still, from a legal point of view and from a risk point of view, a quite important focal point. So you also need to consider, what if the contract is terminated prematurely? How do you stand in terms of getting your investments back? Do you have certain costs and expenses you need to have reimbursed, and so on and so forth? So that is also an important element when you consider your contracting strategy. And I think, without going into further detail and without introducing even more topics, I think that will be enough from my side. And I hope I've pinpointed the important elements you need to focus on when doing contracts in the offshore wind industry. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you, Kristian and Andreas, for that terrific insight into market conditions and supply chain and contracting. To all the listeners out there, please let the questions flow in. We've got two experts here on hand, ready to answer. So ask the hard ones. We've got a couple already. This one is for Kristian. Do the current market delays change anything about the long-term outlook for the build-out of the offshore wind industry in the U.S.?
Well, I don't think so. I think it's a temporary issue that has to be resolved and will be resolved as well. So I think the short answer is is no. I think the political ambitions are there; they remain unchanged, and also with the investments that have already been made by the developers, as I pointed out, there is a big push to get those projects realized. So it's not a lost asset. A piece of seabed is not worth a lot if you don't place anything on it. So the short answer is no.
So suppliers out there, keep on hunting. The industry is building, and contracts are still moving forward. Andreas, do the recent developments in the American market cater to a new approach to contracting? Does anyone here need to change their strategy?
Yeah, I don't think so. Not necessarily. I think the approach that I would recommend now is the same as I would have recommended if we go 6 months or even 2 years back. It is to, as I mentioned before, it is to analyze the situation properly, capture the risks in the contract, pick your fights, be able to at least pursue being able to analyze the contracts in terms of what is the likelihood of a certain risk and what is the impact of a certain risk, and then initiate the contracting process on that basis. And I don't think either that the likelihood of succeeding in the industry has changed. It's still to some extent a struggle for most suppliers. And the bargaining power of the customer is often quite good. That hasn't changed, but it hasn't worsened either. So that's a relief at least.
Oh, that's great. One of the viewers noted that there's a current update in the FIDIC contracting model going on. Do you know how those work streams are moving forward?
Yeah, I know quite a few people who are involved in that work stream, and they are very capable of what they're doing. So I'm looking very much forward to result. On the other hand, I must also say that this work on an offshore wind specific contract in FIDIC system, it's not a new thing. It has been talked about for many years, but it seems that now we're getting closer to a result. What should you expect from that? I don't really know, but my expectation is that it will be quite comparable to the contracts we see today, which are FIDIC based contracts, Yellow Book based contracts, which are modified for being used in the offshore wind industry. So I don't think we'll see significant changes, but at least it has a certain there is a certain quality of a document which has been specifically prepared from scratch for a specific use. So I'm looking forward to seeing that result.
That's great. Here's another question for Kristian. Can you provide any examples of early supply chain localization at the tier 2 level and below in Denmark's supply chain when the offshore wind market began?
Oh, in Denmark supply chain. Well, I think there are multiple examples on that. There are a lot of suppliers to especially the turbine manufacturers, because we have a big turbine manufacturing industry in Denmark. And I think in this case, the suppliers and the OEMs, they grew together. So some of the really good tier 2 suppliers, they are actually working with R&D together with the turbine manufacturers, and then others, they are just really good at doing whatever they are manufacturing in terms of products or services. So I think this goes for Denmark. It will also go for the US, that the ones you need to grow together between tier 1 suppliers. So that means the foundation contractors for the foundation contractors that focus naturally on the balances of plant, which is the foundations, and then for the substation suppliers, there's also a market there, and then with the OEMs of offshore wind turbines moving into the US now with different manufacturing facilities, they need a local supply chain as well. So I think there's a lot of room to grow with those tier 1 suppliers if you're a good tier 2 supplier.
That's perfect. I'm going to ask one.
I can mention. I didn't answer the question. Sorry. It could be gears. It could be brakes. It could be towers. There's a lot of examples on tier 2 suppliers that linked into the tier 1 supply chain. It could be monopile manufacturers.
Control systems also on the electrical
Control
side.
systems. Yeah.
Yeah, there are, I think, a plethora of components when we start to get into that tier 2 finished goods and tier 3 subcomponent opportunities. Really quick, and then I'm going to close things out. And maybe some of these questions we can get written responses and get them posted to folks that participated, if that's okay with you. We've just had a few more come in, but how best can tier 3 suppliers connect with tier 2 suppliers?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think my answer is a bit odd, I would say, but that is to disregard, first of all, that you're a tier 3 supplier. Because if you are teaming up with a tier 2 supplier, you are forming a partnership. And in that sense, it doesn't really matter on what tier you're placed. If you're forming that partnership, what matters is who is the customer. And that is the tier 2 supplier's customer. So if you're a tier 3 supplier, you need to engage with the tier 2 supplier and really emphasize the importance of understanding what is the tier 2 supplier's customers' needs. Because if you approach it in that way, I think that partnership will be quite strong, and you will have 2 entities that will be working together to deliver the best scope. And I think that will also have an impact on the risk side. If you're aware of the needs of the customer, more than you would usually be as a tier 3 supplier supplying to a tier 2 supplier, who in turn would supply to that supplier's customer.
I think this generally applies to the industry, that always focus on your customer, because that's where you help create strategic partnerships. This is how you avoid being the target of a young procurement officer who just wants one thing, which is a low price. So I think only by engaging and understanding the needs of your customer's customer, then you'll be able to actually become a partner and be able to deliver all the good stuff you can do from the US, including local jobs and investments.
That's terrific. Well, I just want to say thanks to you two, and thanks for all the listeners out there that have tuned in to this Learning from the Expert series. A reminder that this presentation was recorded. We'll get that as well as the presentation slides on NYSERDA's website. Next webinar series will be on October 25th and November 8th. And you can register for those future webinars at wind.ny.gov. We also encourage you to check out some of our past webinars, which also provide insight into supply chain, port development, and other aspects of the industry that could be opportunities for growth and transition for your companies into the clean energy industry. And with that, I'll say goodbye to everyone until next time.
Thanks for listening in.
Thank you.